Taking another deep breath in. And here we are, coming back into this beautiful moment with a deep breath in and releasing. So it is. So today's topic, we're going to be kind of mixing up a little bit, but the main thing we're going to be going over in a little bit is mastery of impulse. But as some of you know with me, I always like to spice it up with some whatever thoughts and teachings come to my mind during the week. And one that I thought would be worth sharing, just an introduction of, I'll probably do a whole talk on it at some point, is, isn't it fascinating? Isn't it fascinating that the one thing that we're not taught when we're children is that getting what we want won't lead to happiness? Really think about that for a moment. Getting what we want does not lead to happiness. Or let me reiterate that in a more effective way. Getting what we want does not lead to lasting happiness. It leads to very temporary excitement, pleasure, happiness, satisfaction. But has anyone ever gotten what you wanted and then eventually complained about it? Here's an example. You know, when we're young, sometimes all we want is a relationship or to be touched for the first time. That sounds really weird. But so for me, it was like, I want to hold someone's hand, you know, now I want to have my first kiss, and then I want to have my first relationship. But then often your first relationship is a bit messy, isn't it? You're learning things out. And maybe you stay with the first person you ever date and you marry them, and that's okay too. But has anyone ever had a spouse or a boyfriend or girlfriend or anyone that you've dated been with that irritated you after a while? I think that's a human thing there. Or how about this with a job? You know, maybe you were in between jobs and all. You're just like, oh my gosh, the stress of not being able to pay my bills, it's adding up. I'm stressing out. Please, 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 you're praying to get the job that you applied for. But then once you're in the job you applied for, that gratitude goes away quickly, doesn't it? It normally turns into another complaint, another point of contention. And this really applies to not only the things that we really want, that we think they're going to bring us a lot of joy, but it's also just the random things that are just pleasurable and then the pleasure doesn't last. And anyone that's ever had an addiction knows this to be true, because the dependency manifests in trying to keep that lastingness alive, but that's just not the way this world works. And so wouldn't it be wonderful if we taught our children this? Wouldn't it be wonderful that we taught our children that, you know, you're gonna accomplish things, you're gonna get the things that you want, but please don't be under the misunderstanding that it's gonna be the end all be all for your happiness, for your peace, for your sense of security, for your lasting satisfaction. And it's fascinating even when it comes to money, because I've worked with, like I said, even people who were in prison who came out and didn't even have a penny in their pocket. And then I've worked with multimillionaires as clients. And what's fascinating is, yes, the external circumstances are a bit different, but the internal peace and the internal life satisfaction is not that much different depending on the financial status. And what's interesting is often the people I work with that are multimillionaires that really don't have to necessarily worry about all the little ends and making ends meet, they're actually more stressed out about money because they want to make more, because it turns into this maintaining so many things at once that they have to worry about even a lot more to maintain, but also there's that desire for more security and more security and more security. And it's weird how we never get to this point where we just say, this is enough. And we can get to that point really at any stage of our life, but it's interesting where it's always just a little bit more will make me more secure. A little bit more love will make me more happy. A little bit more excitement, a little bit more pleasure, a little bit, and then it just turns into this neurosis that we trap ourselves in, unfortunately. And then Zen comes along to the West, because it's really only been here. Buddhism has really only incepted Western minds in the last 800 years, and really on a big scale in the last 30 years. And so it's interesting that it's been around for 2,500 years, but only in the West for about 100 years. Isn't that interesting? And so then you have these and again, you kind of had some similar teachings, such as in the Trappist monks with Catholicism, who really take similar vows to Zen monks and other forms of Buddhist monks. But you know, this huge understanding of ego and this huge understanding of impermanence, that nothing stays the same, nothing lasts forever. But here in America, we've created a society where it's almost like that's where we make our money. You know, a lot of products that are being sold to us are all about filling that gap, filling that void, giving that next pleasure, giving that next satisfaction, doing this, doing that. Even in the self-help industry, you know, and I guess I fall into that. But I've really tried to take a step back from making people promises, because I don't know if you're on Facebook, if you're on Instagram, if you're on any type of social media, or even on YouTube, you might see things pop up where it's like promising you, if you follow these steps, you're gonna make $1 million, or you're gonna be reaching enlightenment in no time. You're able, if you just do X, Y, and Z, you're gonna have this result. And what's fascinating is that how often does that actually happen for most people? Probably less than 1%.
I have a question though.
Yes.
I don't necessarily think that more is a bad thing.
Yeah.
It can be, but how do you explain wanting more peace, more spirituality, more God, more Buddha, more this?
Yes. You know, she was doing this. For those who can't see. That is an excellent question. And as long as you're caught up in that more, you're not really going to be able to get peace, more peace. And here's why. Because our attachments of wanting more, that want. And here's like the issue with the law of attraction. Because, and I was big in the law of attraction craze, The Secret, and then Abraham Hicks and all these things, and I'm able to apply it quite well. But what's fascinating is that if there's anything that I'm wanting more in the future, it always takes me out of the present moment. It keeps me from fully appreciating and fully being in the presence of what currently is. And so over the years, I had to shift that desire, even the think and grow rich type energy, where it's like desire is the number one thing that you really want to focus on, and that's what leads to reality creation. And all of this is true. All of this is true, but it's very dangerous. It's a very dangerous line to walk, because we can easily fall off of it and never enjoy a single present moment, because we're always trying to create a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. So the answer is, the issue of more is not the problem. It's our attachment to wanting more. If you can still create more, but without the need and the attachment, getting caught up in saying, once I have this, then I'll feel this, then you're going to be okay. But if you're always caught up in the reality or the delusion of, once I have this, then I'll feel this, you're going to notice that every time you get a little bit more, you're not satisfied. And so you're going to want a little bit more after that. Still not satisfied. So you're still going to want a little bit more after that. And it can even be things, like I said, in the self-help industry, you know, wanting peace, wanting healing, wanting all this stuff. But then here's going back to the main crux of how I started this conversation. Nothing lasts. And so getting what you want does not lead to lasting happiness, does not lead to lasting satisfaction. It's so interesting that even with me creating this space, all of a sudden, right now I'm in the process of thinking, okay, how can we create a bigger space for people? Isn't that fascinating? And so it's only been freaking 6 months. But I'm like, okay, we could benefit from a bigger space and be able to do more things, and then not having my dog on the other side, or I'm constantly having to worry about not having my dog, you know, having to be in sessions with me, then they interrupt. And so all I ever wanted 6 months ago was to have a thriving community and a thriving coaching practice, which I now have. But then the ego says, yeah, but. And so I've been able to take a step back and say, yes, these are issues that are going to be addressed in time, but I'm not going to attach my peace in the moment, or my satisfaction, or my happiness in the moment, to waiting for that to arrive. Because it most likely will at some point, but you don't know when it will arrive. Even before I moved here and I was selling my business in Arizona, it was that weird couple month period where it's like it was no longer my business, but I was still having to work there. And then the new people were coming in and changing everything up. I could have been in the belief, well, it's like, well, once I'm in Colorado, everything will be peaceful again, and I'll be able to plant my roots down, have my center. Oh, dear gosh. the remodeling of this took 6 bloody months. And then, you know, for 4 of those months, I was sleeping in the pulled up tile and carpet with pits in the hole for the construction on an air mattress in what is now the kitchen. And so, you know, that led to some suffering, not able to bathe. We didn't have a shower and stuff. So it's like the mind is always saying once this comes, but then often once you get that thing, it becomes more stressful for a while. Who's ever planned a wedding? It's supposed to be this really joyous time, but it often turns into like the epitome of stress. Not for everyone. For Andrew and I, it wasn't so much, but even watching now some of my friends and them going through the wedding planning process and the expectation of what it should look like and their expectations versus maybe family's expectations of what they want in it, it turns into this really awful experience. Where it's not necessarily this huge moment of joy, or maybe there is joy in it, but it's also there's a lot of stress and pressure and expectation, and then you put so much wanting a perfectionism in it, because some people, you know, back in the day it was more often like there's like, well, you only have it once, you know, now you might marry someone else in the future. You never go into it thinking that though. But it's like this idea of wanting it to be perfect. And often when you have that idea, it's very hard for you to even be present during the ceremony. And I have officiated many weddings over the years because I'm also a minister. And it's interesting where I always have people take breaths while they're taking their vows because they tend to black out. I don't know if you can remember if you've been in a ceremony before. It's like you're not even present there with it because it's like it's just getting through it. And so it's like, let's take a breath, let's take a breath, let's ground in this moment, let's ground in this moment, because this is supposed to be this really happy time, this happy, joyful time, even this peaceful time if you want it to be peaceful. But if you're not breathing, you're not mindful with it, and it goes by like that. And so again, that there's this idea that these things that we're grasping for in the future often become the very source of our stress. Who's ever had a child? And you're probably, not necessarily, but you're probably really excited and happy about having a child. But then don't they become like this, they just keep on giving. Oh boy. They just keep on giving in a lot of ways that actually do not lead to, they don't always lead to joy. Does this spark joy? And so it's interesting that I've seen people who they may have had complication. They've been trying so hard to create a baby together, and then finally they create that baby, and for the first couple of years, man, no more sleep, right? And so it's interesting that it then becomes this very joyous, happy thing, but then also this part where, you know, you're almost slipping not in non-reality and going crazy from the lack of sleep and the constant stress. And then now finances get a little bit tighter. And so the moral of the story, I guess what I'm trying to share here, is just stop putting all your fucking eggs in one basket. Because that's what we do. We have this neurotic need to place all of our hopes and dreams and our desires and our hope for comfort and happiness and joy in these future projections. But then every single time, it doesn't matter what it is, even if it's creating a freaking Zen center, it becomes a source of contention. And that's just the way the ego works. And it's not bad, it's not wrong. But it's important to understand this, that even when we get what we want, we're still not going to be fully happy. But that doesn't mean that you can't cultivate inner peace. And the inner peace that I'm talking about is that when you start to develop radical acceptance.
I want to share too, I also think getting what you want can be a source of happiness. And it's really important not to shame or blame yourself for accomplishing things in the world. But if you don't do it with a foundation of mindfulness and transcendence of this ridiculous notion that it will be some type of permanent happiness, you know, then it definitely leads to these delusional stories and this neurotic activity that, you know, is extraordinarily wasteful often. So
absolutely,
yeah, I think that's all really, really important.
Yeah, and it really is important to say that. Thank you. You know, not to shame or blame ourselves with getting what we want, because it does. You know, everything that we're doing, you know, it's not to say don't plan for the future. It's really just going back to not having that attachment to it. You know, the final three tenets are: I release my attachment to the mundane world, I release my attachment to what I know, I release my attachment to who I am. So it's not so much releasing the mundane world, it's not releasing knowing, it's not releasing self, it's releasing the attachment to these things, because it's the attachment that keeps us in the suffering, where we always want something to look a certain way. And then once it looks a certain way, then we can relax into it. But here in Zen, we're learning to relax into things. Really hear this. We learn to relax into things even when they don't go as planned. We learn to relax into things even if it's not what we want. We learn to relax into things even if it is what we want, but then we're noticing that it's now changing because nothing stays the same. Because again, you know, you have an idea of what the wedding will look like. You have an idea of what the child will look like when you raise them. You might have an idea what the marriage will look like, but many people have attested to this. Once you get married, the relationship changes. And so that doesn't always happen, but a lot of times if you're trying to put your best foot forward and then you're trying to win someone as a groom or a bride, and then you get married, and once the conquest is done, things change. But when you don't treat relationships and dating like that, there really isn't a transfer over from non-married life to married life. But for most people, that does happen. I've worked with so many clients over the years where they're just like, it was like a day and night switch. And so think about that. You have an anticipation of what aging might look like. You have an anticipation of what a job might look like, but very rarely do things go as planned. And that's really important to understand, that that's okay. Really hear that. It's okay. But when you attach to it not being okay, and then you resist it, what happens? Pain, suffering. It turns into the lingering form. Pain turns into its lingering cousin, suffering. Because pain is often very temporary, but then we keep reliving it day in and day out as long as we resist it. And that's where I often teach about grief, and how when you have sadness and acceptance, it turns into appreciation. But when you have sadness and resistance, it turns into grief, and it keeps that grief alive for a very, very long time. And that's where this radical acceptance comes into play, and why it's so important for us to honor that getting what we want does not lead to lasting happiness. It leads to temporary happiness. But we have to keep doing the work on a daily basis of acceptance, of patience, of compassion, invoking these positive attributes so that we can create a foundation of peace in our lives, versus thinking, well, once I go on vacation, then I can relax, versus asking ourselves the question, how can I relax a little bit more into every day? How can I relax into the difficult situations of my life every single day? Well, the answer is stop freaking resisting it and accept that that's the current reality, because guess what? Shitty things happen to every single person on this planet. But depending on how you're battling it in your mind, that shitty thing can either like stay with you 24/7, and then you take it home from work and then you're laying there at bed, you know, thinking about it at night, or the shitty thing stays in its own little cubicle, and then when you come home from work, now you're at work. Or maybe it's flipped. Maybe you love your job, but you're having a difficult home life right now. But then your home life starts to seep into your work life. And again, it's all the ways in which we're resisting. One of the most dangerous things to say, and it's a paradox because it also leads to transformation, but a dangerous thing to say is, oh, I wish this wasn't happening right now. That leads to resistance. When you say, I wish this wasn't happening right now, it allows the ego to kind of like get its claws in. And throughout the day, you're going to keep hearing that thought, that grumbling. But when you say, I accept that this is how things are right now, it actually allows you to relax into it. And when you accept it, you can actually start making choices to improve the situation a little bit more. But when we're caught up in the resistance of it, it actually drains you more because you're always thinking about it. And when you're always thinking about it, you're actually less prepared for your day because you're freaking exhausted before the day even starts, before you even clock in for anything. Before you clock into the marriage, before you clock into work, before you clock into any of your endeavors that you're working on, your family life, it doesn't matter what it is. You're exhausted because you're resisting in your mind. So let's take a breath. So going back to mastery of impulse, we have responding to life versus reacting to life. And I just put a little thing here on the top of the handout. Reacting is a temporary release, relief, or egoic satisfaction. Obviously, that's not the only definition, but that's just what I'm throwing at you today. But when you react to things impulsively, you're doing so because subconsciously you get a temporary release, relief, and egoic satisfaction. You know, when you feel anger building up and then you snap out at someone, what you're doing is you're that volcano that's letting off the steam. And so there is this weird reward system that happens when you behave in a very not great way. But that's why you do it, because there is something that you're getting from it. But you must remember that it's a temporary relief, and it often leads to burning people around you that then you have to spend time fixing later. So it's not worth reacting and losing your shit, because then you just create a few more fires. The fire was within you, but then you let the fire out of you, and then you burn a few people around you, and then you have to take all this extra time putting out those fires. Then you go to therapy, and it just turns into this long ass thing. 10 years later, here we still are. And again, so what do we do instead of that? Well, we start to learn how to respond to life rather than react to life. And I know this sounds like one of those cute self-help posters that you'll see on like a school wall. Respond, don't react. But it's true. And these fun little posters that you see hanged everywhere in doctor's office, school counselor's office, and just anywhere you go, they're there because they're actually true. They're oversimplified, but often a lot of the simple truths in life actually hold the deepest wisdoms, which you can realize in Zen because they're all about simplicity. So really think about that. How do we respond? How do we react? Well, in my book, I teach the PPR method. And for those of you who are clients or students, you know this because we really go deeper into that in our one-on-one sessions. But the PPR is pause, process, and respond. Really hear that for a moment. Pause, process, and respond. And so if you think about PPR on a daily basis, you're going to notice that the next time you get triggered and you feel that desire to react, you're going to have this little Zen cowboy's voice in your head that says PPR. And you're like, what does that stand for again? Yeah. And then it confuses you, and then the moment of reacting has passed. No, that has happened to a few people. But most often you remember what it stands for, and it's pause, process, and respond. And so the pausing is taking a deep breath in. And the process is don't do that. Or don't react. Actually, it's more like, I understand that there's never a reason good enough to act out of alignment with peace. If you read the entirety of my book, Living Peace, will really bring that point home. There's never a reason good enough to act out of alignment with peace, because even in life and death situations, you have to think rationally. And if you're freaking out and losing yourself, you're not going to be able to effectively respond. And yes, we could say that, paramedics are reacting to the situation in a healthy way, but we would rather define it so we help this definition. They're responding to the situation in a healthy way, while reacting would be just blindly rushing forward, if that makes sense. And so if we're in the middle of Vallecito Lake and I push you in, do you want to respond to that or react to that? If you react to that, you're probably freaking out, and then you're going to drown. And not to say I'm ever going to push someone, but if you're reacting to being in water, you're freaking out, and then you're like, oh shit, let me just take a breath and float on my back. Here we are. So when you react in water and you get terrified and scared, it's very difficult to stay afloat. But when you focus on your breathing, it's actually very easy for humans to float. But again, there's even been people who can't swim, and then they're in like 3 feet of water, and they're just like, just fucking stand up. But again, the mind and the body collapse in on each other in fear and in that blind haze of reaction, and we don't think rationally anymore, and we hurt ourselves. And so when you get triggered by loved ones, when you get triggered by the world, you're going to react in a way that you're just spilling your energy everywhere. It's like you're flailing about in water. But that's why we want to bring back to point that mind-body awareness, that mind-body connection, by using our breath. Pausing, effectively processing, because deep breathing actually sends oxygen to the brain that allows you to think more clearly. When you're stressed, normally you take shallow breaths, so it actually hurts your brain. And so you breathe in, sending oxygen in. How can I respond to the situation rather than react to it? How can I respond more peacefully, more patiently, more compassionately? How can I listen more effectively rather than defending myself, offending other people, spitting out, interrupting people? Let me just listen right now. And then I respond. And again, this is super simplified, but in my book, Living Peace, I go deeper into it. And of course, one-on-one, I always like to personalize it for people. And then you can even read some fun stuff. I'm actually not going to read this today because the sermon's already gone on pretty long, but you can read some fun stuff that I put in your little handout as well when you get home. Because I wanted to conclude today with a fun little story. I've been reading one or two of these each week lately from Thich Nhat Hanh's book, At Home in the World, Essential Teachings from a Monk's Life. And again, since some of you are new, he's a monk from Vietnam who's actually kicked out of Vietnam for preaching peace. He never picked sides. He wasn't for or against the Americans. He wasn't for or against the Vietnamese people. He was just for peace. He wanted everyone to come together and to recognize their own suffering. And so he's been through 2 wars, and he's even been at gunpoint before, and he's just suffered a lot. Yet at the end of the day, he never gave up his peace practice. And that's why he's like one of the leading people of mindfulness and peace right now on our planet. And he has Plum Village in France, which is one of the largest monasteries in the Western world. So he's a really, really wonderful person. Closing the door. Children sometimes ask me, why do you meditate? I meditate because I love it. But I don't just love sitting meditation. I also love meditating while walking or even while standing. Suppose you need to stand in line waiting for your turn to buy or serve yourself some food. You can take the opportunity to practice mindful breathing, aware of your in-breath and your out-breath, enjoying yourself in the presence of the people around you. Meditation can be very informal. When you drive, if you drive with mindfulness, enjoying your in-breath and out-breath, we can say you are practicing meditation. When you wash the dishes, if you enjoy breathing in and breathing out and you smile, the dishwashing becomes very pleasant. I enjoy washing dishes very much. Washing dishes is not only to have clean dishes, but to simply enjoy the time of washing dishes. With the energy of mindfulness, every action in our daily life can become pleasurable. Deep breath. I practice this lesson every day. One day, when I was a novice monk, my teacher asked me to do something for him. I was very excited to do it for him because I love my teacher very much. So I rushed out to do it. But because I was so excited, I wasn't mindful enough, and I slammed the door on my way out. My teacher called me back and said, "My child, please go out and close the door again, but this time do better than you did before." Hearing his words, I knew that my practice had been lacking. So I bowed to my teacher and walked to the door with all my being, every step with mindfulness. I went out and very mindfully closed the door after me. My teacher did not have to tell me a second time. Now, every time I open and close a door, I do so with mindfulness, remembering my teacher. Many years later, I was in Kentucky with Thomas Merton, a Trappist monk, and I told him the story. He said, "Well, I noticed that without you telling me. I have seen the way you close the door." A month after I left his monastery in Kentucky, he gave a talk to his students and told them the story of me closing the door. One day, many years later, a Catholic woman from Germany came on retreat to our Plum Village practice center in France. On her last day, she told us that she had come only out of curiosity. She had listened to the recording of Thomas Merton's talk, and she had come to see how I closed the door. Deep breath. And so before reading the story many years ago, I actually did that to a student of mine when we were sitting in my office, and she reached for a tissue from a tissue box, and she knocked it over because she was so hasty with it. And so I said, "Could you please pick it up and please do that again?" Well, she did it the second time, and it was still very hasty. It didn't get knocked over, but it wobbled quite a bit. And so I said, "Could you please do that one more time, but with great mindfulness and great respect towards the tissue?" And so she reached over very gracefully, picked it up, and so even in our emotionalness, we can still practice grace. We could still practice mindfulness. And so that awareness stuck with her many years later. And so even if you don't know where to begin in your practice, maybe you feel so overwhelmed with these teachings, the easiest thing you could start doing on a daily basis is just How are your movements? Just observe the way in which you're walking. Observe the way in which you're opening and closing doors. Observe the way in which you're reaching for things. Is it in a haste, or is it very mindful and with grace and respect? Even if you just start doing that on a daily basis, you're going to notice that peace is going to start to take up residence within yourself more, because you're becoming a vessel for it to take up residence in. If you're constantly running around, it's going to be hard for peace to catch up. So let's take a breath. And so I hope I was able to really bring this talk into understanding, because obviously wanting things is not a bad thing. You know, this place wouldn't exist if I didn't have dreams. This book that I wrote, Living Peace, if I wasn't very consistent and mindful and wanting to be an author, wanting to write, it would not exist. And so my whole life and my accomplishments have been created from a place of desire and wanting. But the thing that I have learned now versus 10 years ago is that I don't have to suffer through it. And anytime in the creation process, I don't have to suffer when things are taking longer than anticipated, or things going this way instead of that way. And there's just always a reason that we can complain, even with the beautiful things that we're creating. And so when we're able to take a step back and still say, I'm still like Abraham Hicks says, you're a creator of life. You create your reality. That's never going to stop. But when you release that constant attachment of wanting things to look a certain way, then you can actually relax into the moment. And I genuinely believe that the more inner peace you have, the more direction that you can actually direct the flow of creation, direct the flow of manifestation, because we're no longer caught up in the egoic struggle of resisting the push, the pull, and the hold tight, as I teach in Living Peace. So I hope that offers some clarity. Let's take a breath. Beautiful, beautiful talk today. I want to thank those of you who are joining in after the fact through YouTube. And as always, I have links down below. Your donations help us tremendously. So there's links that you can subscribe to Patreon if you just want to donate a few dollars a month, or if you just want to give a just random donation here and there. That is always very, very appreciated. Thank you. We will see you next week.